Imagine a world where two mighty empires exist at opposite ends of the earth, completely unaware of each other's existence. In the east, the Han Dynasty of China, a civilization of silk, paper, and bronze. In the west, the Roman Empire, with its legions, concrete, and gold. Between them lies a vast, deadly expanse of deserts, mountains, and steppes. But what if I told you that a single, almost accidental journey would stitch these two worlds together, creating a superhighway of trade, ideas, and disease that would reshape human history for centuries? This is not just a story of merchants and camels. It's a tale of spies, prisoners, and ambitious emperors. This is the story of the Silk Road. And it begins not with a grand expedition, but with a desperate man, a secret mission, and a 10-year captivity that would change the world forever. Our story begins in 138 BC, in the court of Emperor Wu of Han. He is young, ambitious, and obsessed with a nomadic threat that has plagued his borders for generations, the Xiongnu. But the emperor has a plan. He needs an ally, a legendary people known as the Yuezhi, who were driven from their homeland by the Xiongnu. He needs someone to find them and forge an alliance. He chooses a court official named Zhang Qian. This is not a mission of trade, it is a mission of war. But as Zhang Qian and his small caravan of 100 men cross into the Gobi Desert, they are ambushed by a Xiongnu patrol. In a single, brutal moment, the grand diplomatic mission is crushed. Zhang Qian is captured, his men are killed or enslaved, and he is taken as a prisoner to the Xiongnu chieftain, who sees more value in keeping him alive than in killing him. For 10 long years, Zhang Qian lives as a captive. He is given a Xiongnu wife, children, and a semblance of a life. But he never forgets his mission. The Xiongnu, believing him broken and resigned to his fate, eventually relax their watch. It is during this time that Zhang Qian makes the most critical decision of his life. He doesn't try to escape back to China. He escapes forward, into the unknown west, still searching for the Yuezhi. This act of defiance, fueled by sheer willpower, is what separates him from a mere survivor. He is a man on a mission, and his loyalty to his emperor is stronger than any chain. He endures unimaginable hardship, crossing the harsh Tien Shan mountains and treacherous deserts, just to keep a promise he made to himself and his emperor over a decade ago. After an incredible journey, Zhang Qian finally finds the Yuezhi. But he is met with a devastating anticlimax. The Yuezhi have found a new, fertile land in the west, a land they now call home. They have no desire for revenge against the Xiongnu. For them, the past is the past. They politely but firmly refuse his alliance. Zhang Qian, after years of hardship and a mission that has taken him to the edge of the known world, has failed. But what he brings back with him is far more valuable than a military treaty. He carried with him not just his life, but a treasure trove of intelligence. He has detailed accounts of new kingdoms, powerful armies, and cultures the Han never even knew existed. And most importantly, he tells them of a land called Dayuan, where they breed horses that sweat blood, horses that are faster, stronger, and more majestic than anything in China. Zhang Qian finally returns to Chang'an in 125 BC, after being away for 13 years. He is not a triumphant general, he is a weary survivor. Yet, when he kneels before Emperor Wu, his words are more powerful than any army. He describes the Fergana horses, so powerful they were said to sweat blood. He describes kingdoms with sophisticated cultures and vast wealth. He paints a picture of a world beyond the desert, a world ripe for influence and trade. Emperor Wu, obsessed with these heavenly horses and the idea of expanding his power, is electrified. He understands that Zhang Qian has not just returned with stories, he has found a key to a new world. This is the moment the Silk Road is born, not as a route for silk, but as a strategic imperative for an emperor's ambition and a general's desire for superior cavalry. So, the Han Empire goes to war. Not just to secure silk, but to secure the source of these magnificent horses. They launch massive campaigns against the Xiongnu, pushing them back and opening a corridor to the west. This is the true beginning of the Silk Road, a road paved with military conquest and imperial ambition. But this is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning. The road Zhang Qian helped open will soon be bustling not with armies, but with caravans carrying more than just silk. They will carry Buddhism, Christianity, the secrets of papermaking, and the plagues that will topple empires. The question is, can this fragile thread of trade survive the centuries of chaos that are coming? And what happens when the West, with its insatiable appetite for silk, finally discovers the source of its most luxurious fabric? The answer will come from a future emperor, a forgotten city, and a secret that will be buried in sand for millennia. But that is a story for the next part of our journey. If you want to walk that road with us again, make sure you're subscribed, because the path ahead is far more dangerous than you can imagine. But here's the twist that history books love to skip: the Silk Road wasn't a road at all. There was no paved highway, no signposts, no rest stops with camel parking. It was a sprawling, chaotic web of trails that snaked through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name literally means, "you go in and you never come out," was just one of the obstacles. To the north, the frozen steppes; to the south, the towering Himalayas. And yet, despite these terrifying natural barriers, something incredible happened. The goods didn't move in one grand caravan from China to Rome. They moved in stages, like a relay race across the continent. A Chinese merchant would sell his silk in Kashgar. A Sogdian trader would take it to Samarkand. A Persian merchant would carry it to Baghdad. An Assyrian might finally sell it to a Roman centurion. Each handoff added cost, added risk, and added a little bit of legend to the fabric. By the time Roman matrons flaunted their translucent silk dresses, the stories claimed it came from magical trees in a far-off land. Now, imagine you are one of those merchants. You're not a rich trader, you're a middleman, a Sogdian from the fertile valleys of Central Asia. Your life is a constant negotiation with death. You hire guides who read the stars and the shifting sands. You pack your Bactrian camels with water, dried meat, and bolts of the finest silk. You join a caravan of hundreds, because safety is in numbers. The bandits, the elusive raiders who knew every hidden pass, were a constant threat. But the desert was the true master. A sudden sandstorm could bury your entire caravan in minutes. A mirage could lead you miles off course to a waterless grave. You learn to read the subtle signs, the color of the sand at dusk, the behavior of the birds. You pray to your gods, and you hope the spirits of the desert are merciful. For every successful merchant who made a fortune, 10 others vanished without a trace, their bones and their cargo slowly becoming part of the landscape. This was the price of silk. It wasn't just expensive, it was bought with blood, sweat, and sheer human will. But it wasn't just silk that moved along these trails. That's the common misconception. Silk was the glittering prize, the engine of the economy, but it was the invisible cargo that truly shaped the world. Think about paper. For centuries, the Chinese guarded the secret of papermaking with their lives. It was a state secret, punishable by death to reveal. But as with all secrets, it leaked. By the 8th century, Arab armies captured Chinese papermakers at the Battle of Talas and forced them to reveal their craft. Within a generation, paper mills were popping up in Baghdad, and the knowledge spread like wildfire across the Islamic world and into Europe. The same story repeated itself with the compass, gunpowder, and the art of printing. These weren't just products, they were the operating systems of civilization. They would ignite the Renaissance, fuel the age of exploration, and ultimately, shatter the medieval world. The Silk Road was the world's first information superhighway, and its most valuable exports were often intangible. They were ideas that traveled in the minds of pilgrims, scholars, and refugees, more powerful than any army. Now, let's talk about the most dangerous passenger of all, religion. Buddhism was born in India, but it found its true home thousands of miles away in China and Japan. How? It hitched a ride on the Silk Road. It started with a handful of monks and merchants who carried the Buddha's teachings in their hearts and in precious manuscripts. They traveled along the same routes as the silk, but their cargo was far more revolutionary. These weren't just stories, they were a new way of understanding existence, of escaping suffering. It offered hope to peasants and emperors alike. In the oasis cities of the Darim Basin, Buddhism exploded. Majestic cave temples, like the ones at Dunhuang, were carved out of cliffs, filled with thousands of statues and murals depicting the life of the Buddha. These weren't just religious sites, they were pit stops on the spiritual highway. A weary traveler could find solace here, a place to pray for a safe journey or to give thanks for a successful one. The faith didn't just cross the desert, it transformed the desert, turning these barren outposts into centers of culture, learning, and art. The Silk Road was doing something no empire could do, it was stitching together the souls of the East and West. But while Buddhism was spreading east, a different kind of cargo was heading west, one that would bring an empire to its knees. The Romans were obsessed with silk. They paid for it in gold, and this was a massive drain on their economy. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained that silk was bleeding the empire dry, that 1,000,000 sesterces a year were flowing east. But the Romans had no idea what they were actually buying. They believed silk came from a mysterious tree, or perhaps a giant worm. The secret of the silkworm, that it was a caterpillar that spun its cocoon, was China's most guarded treasure. The Chinese were so protective that they killed anyone who tried to smuggle silkworm eggs out of the country. For centuries, this worked. Rome remained in the dark, happily paying its gold for a fabric they didn't understand. This economic imbalance, more than any barbarian invasion, was slowly destabilizing the Roman world. The empire was literally hemorrhaging wealth to a land it had never seen, for a product it didn't truly know. The silk itself wasn't just a luxury, it was a strategic weapon. So here's the question that haunts the rest of this story: what happens when this fragile, invisible thread of trade becomes the only thing holding the world together? The Silk Road was never just about silk. It was a network of connections that carried the seeds of both creation and destruction. It brought gold to China and silk to Rome, but it also carried the bubonic plague out of the East, a disease that would go on to kill a third of Europe's population in the Black Death. The same routes that spread enlightenment also spread the apocalypse. The road that built empires also destroyed them. It's a terrifying paradox. The very thing that made the world rich and connected also made it vulnerable. And as we'll see, the fate of nations would hinge on who controlled these paths, and who could keep them open. The stage is set for a clash of titans, a war for the soul of the world's most valuable highway. In our next episode, we'll uncover the secret of the most powerful dynasty to ever rule the East, and the empire that rose from the ashes of Rome to challenge it. What if the key to world domination wasn't an army, but a single, invisible thread? Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter of this epic journey. But while Rome was bleeding gold, the Han Dynasty was building something far more dangerous than a trade route, it was building a war machine. Emperor Wu Di wasn't just interested in silk, he wanted the legendary horses of Fergana, beasts that could outrun any cavalry in the world. He sent an army of 60,000 men, 10,000 oxen, and 30,000 horses on a campaign that would cover over 3,000 miles of hostile terrain. They crossed deserts where the sand burned hot enough to melt the soles of their boots, and mountains so high that men dropped dead from the thin air. When they finally reached Fergana, they didn't just ask for the horses, they demanded them. The king refused, so the Han army laid siege to his capital. The result? A bloody victory that secured the horses, but at a staggering cost. Most of the army never made it home. Yet for Wu Di, the price was worth it. With these horses, he could project power across the entire known world, and the Silk Road became not just a highway of commerce, but a military lifeline. With the horses secured, Emperor Wu Di turned his attention to securing the road itself. He ordered the construction of a string of garrisons that would anchor the Silk Road in Chinese territory. The most important of these was the Jade Gate, a massive fortress built in the middle of the desert, named for the precious jade that flowed through it from Khotan. Beyond this gate lay the western regions, the wild, dangerous territories that were only loosely controlled. But the Jade Gate was more than a customs post. It was a statement. It said, everything east of here is China, and we will defend it to the death. To feed these garrisons, the Han government implemented a system of military farming, where soldiers would grow their own grain in the arid soil. It was a brilliant strategy that turned barren land into a sustainable military zone. This allowed them to project power without relying on long, vulnerable supply lines. The Silk Road wasn't just being traveled anymore, it was being fortified, stone by stone. But the Han Empire wasn't just securing its borders, it was guarding a secret. The production of silk was a state monopoly, and the penalty for smuggling silkworm eggs out of China was death. The Chinese had perfected a process that was impossibly complex, raising silkworms on mulberry leaves, carefully boiling the cocoons to extract a single, continuous thread that could be over a mile long. It took thousands of cocoons to make a single robe. This wasn't just an industry, it was a technological marvel that no other civilization could replicate. So valuable was the secret that the Han government employed inspectors to ensure that no one left the country with the eggs hidden in their luggage or in their hair. They even executed a princess who was caught trying to smuggle eggs in her elaborate headdress when she was sent to marry a foreign king. For centuries, this secret held. The West was left to wonder at the magical fabric, completely unaware that it came from a humble caterpillar. It was the greatest and longest-held trade secret in history. While the Chinese guarded their secrets, a new power was rising in the West that would come to control the very heart of the Silk Road. The Parthians were a formidable empire based in what is now Iran. They weren't just warriors, they were master middlemen. They sat right between China and Rome and controlled the flow of goods with an iron fist. They would buy silk from the east and sell it to the Romans at an astronomical markup, all while maintaining the illusion that they were the producers of this precious fabric. The Parthians didn't want the Romans and the Chinese to ever meet, because if they did, their entire business model would collapse. They spread rumors of impossible distances and terrifying monsters to discourage travelers from going further. They even staged elaborate shows where they would burn silk in front of Roman envoys to demonstrate their supposed wealth and disinterest in trade. It was a brilliant, cynical deception that made them one of the wealthiest empires in the world, and it kept the two greatest powers on earth permanently in the dark about each other. But the Parthians were about to face a threat they couldn't buy their way out of. In the east, the Han Dynasty was pushing further west, and in the west, a new superpower was rising, Rome. The Romans were not content to simply pay exorbitant prices to the Parthians. They wanted direct access to the fabled silk. In 53 BC, the Roman general Crassus led a massive invasion of Parthia, hoping to conquer the land and seize control of the Silk Road. He marched his army into the desert, confident in his heavy infantry. But the Parthians were masters of a different kind of warfare. They were horse archers, and they used a tactic that would become legendary, the Parthian shot. They would feign retreat, drawing the Romans into a trap, and then turn around in the saddle to unleash a hail of arrows while riding away. The Roman legions were decimated. Crassus was killed, and his standards were captured. This was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, and it showed the world that the Silk Road was not a place for amateurs. That crushing defeat at Carrhae didn't just humiliate Rome, it created a permanent scar on the Roman psyche. For decades, the Romans would dream of revenge and of reaching the Silk Lands, but they were now locked in an endless, brutal struggle with the Parthians. The Silk Road had become a geopolitical chessboard, with the Parthians masterfully playing the two superpowers against each other. But while the empires fought and schemed, a different kind of revolution was happening on the road itself. The Sogdians, a people from the fertile valleys of Central Asia, were becoming the true power brokers of the Silk Road. They weren't warriors or emperors, they were merchants, and they spoke every language from China to Persia. They established trading networks that spanned thousands of miles, and their influence was felt in every city along the route. They were the ones who really made the Silk Road work, moving goods, ideas, and even religions. They were the invisible hand guiding the world's economy. But their world of commerce was about to be shattered by a force so destructive that it would make the war between Rome and Parthia look like a petty squabble. What if the real threat to this entire world wasn't an invading army, but a single, microscopic organism hiding in the fur of a flea? What if the next great power to rise wasn't an empire, but a plague? Subscribe now, and join us as we uncover the dark secret that will change the course of human history forever. But what happens to a road when the empire that built it collapses? For centuries, the Han Dynasty had been the beating heart of the Silk Road, pumping soldiers, silk, and order into its veins. But now, that heart was failing. Corruption gnawed at the court from within. Peasant revolts erupted like boils across the countryside. And the Yellow Turban Rebellion, a massive uprising fueled by famine and desperation, shook the dynasty to its core. The Han emperors lost control, and ambitious warlords tore the empire apart. The Silk Road, once a highway of imperial ambition, suddenly had no one to protect it. The garrisons in the Heshi corridor were abandoned, the beacon towers fell silent, and the caravans became easy prey for bandits. The world's most important trade route was about to enter its darkest age. The question was, could it survive without the empire that created it? Or was the Silk Road destined to vanish, just as the Han Dynasty was about to? But this was not the end. The Silk Road was too valuable to simply die. As the Han Empire fractured, new centers of power emerged along the route. In the Tarim Basin, the Oasis kingdoms, once mere vassals of the Chinese, now tasted independence. The most important of these was the Kingdom of Khotan. For centuries, Khotan had been a vital stop on the southern Silk Road, but now it transformed into a beacon of culture and wealth. And at the heart of this transformation was a new faith, Buddhism. It didn't arrive with an army. It arrived with merchants and monks, traveling on the same caravans that carried silk and spices. The kings of Khotan embraced this new religion, building magnificent monasteries and stupas that rivaled anything in India or China. They saw themselves not just as traders, but as guardians of the Dharma. The desert cities of the Tarim Basin were becoming something the world had never seen, centers where Indian thought met Chinese art, and where Persian ideas mixed with local traditions. This was the Silk Road's golden age of culture, born from the ashes of political collapse. Now, a new kind of traveler began to dominate the road. Not soldiers, not merchants, but pilgrims. They were driven by a quest that was more valuable than gold. They wanted to find the original scriptures of their faith, to visit the holy sites of Buddhism, and to understand the true teachings of the Buddha. The most famous of these early pilgrims was a Chinese monk named Faxian. In 399 AD, he left the chaos of China and set out on an epic journey that would last for 15 years. He crossed the Taklamakan Desert, a place he described as having no birds in the air, and no animals on the ground. He traveled through Khotan and across the mountain passes into India. His journey was not just a physical ordeal, it was a spiritual quest that would change the intellectual landscape of East Asia. When he finally returned to China, he brought back a treasure trove of sacred texts. But his story reveals a deeper truth: the Silk Road was no longer just a route for goods. It was now a conduit for the most powerful ideas in human history. The very soul of Asia was being reshaped, one pilgrimage at a time. But even as Buddhism spread east, the very goods that gave the road its name were changing hands in surprising new ways. The Han monopoly on silk was breaking down. In the oasis states, local rulers began to develop their own silk production, using techniques that had leaked out of China over the centuries. The silk from Khotan, while not as fine as the imperial silk, was becoming a sought-after commodity. This new competition changed the dynamics of trade. It wasn't just China exporting silk anymore, the entire oasis region was becoming a silk-producing zone. This meant that the Sogdian merchants, the master middlemen, had even more goods to trade. They were now buying silk in Khotan, selling it in Persia, and bringing back glassware from Rome and silver from the east. The road was becoming a more complex, more vibrant economic system. It was no longer a simple line between two empires, but a vast network of production and exchange. The empires had fought and died, but the merchants and their goods were adapting, thriving, and weaving a new, more intricate tapestry of commerce across the entire continent. While the East was experiencing a cultural renaissance, the West was about to undergo a violent political revolution. The Parthian Empire, the great rival of Rome, was crumbling. Decades of wars with Rome, internal dynastic feuds, and a failing economy had left it weak and vulnerable. And from the shadows, a new power was rising. In 224 AD, a Persian nobleman named Ardashir I led a revolt against the Parthian king. He was from a line of priests and warriors, and he claimed descent from the ancient Achaemenid kings who had ruled Persia centuries before. Within 2 years, he had toppled the Parthian regime and established a new empire, the Sassanid Empire. This was not just a change of dynasty. The Sassanids were fiercely Persian, proud of their heritage, and they had a vision of restoring Persia to its former glory. They were also brilliant administrators and ruthless warriors. For the Silk Road, this meant a new, more powerful gatekeeper in the West. The Sassanids were determined to control every aspect of the trade that passed through their lands, and they were about to make the Parthians look like amateurs in the game of economic exploitation. The rise of the Sassanid Empire was a turning point for the Silk Road. They immediately set out to maximize their profits, imposing heavy tolls and taxes on every caravan that crossed their territory. They saw the Silk Road not as a conduit for cultural exchange, but as a strategic asset, a source of immense wealth to fund their military ambitions. Their control was absolute. They rebuilt the cities of Mesopotamia, turning them into massive trading hubs. They established a state religion, Zoroastrianism, which gave them a powerful ideological weapon to unite their people. But their greatest ambition was to cut Rome out of the silk trade entirely. They wanted to be the sole intermediary between East and West. The Romans, who had been buying silk through Persian middlemen for centuries, were now facing a far more formidable and hostile opponent. The stage was set for a conflict that would define the ancient world for the next 400 years. The Sassanid Empire was not just a new dynasty, it was a wall. And behind that wall, they guarded a secret worth more than any treasure. The secret of the silk itself. But even the mightiest walls can be breached. What if the secret wasn't as safe as they thought? And what if the next great threat to their power didn't come from Rome, but from a source they had completely overlooked? Subscribe now, and join us as we uncover the fate of the Silk Road's most guarded secret, and the man who would risk everything to steal it. From the ashes of Parthia, a new superpower had risen, and it was hungry for more than just gold. The Sassanid Empire, under its warrior kings, saw Rome not as a trading partner, but as a rival to be crushed. And in 260 AD, they did the unthinkable. In the scorched plains of Edessa, the Sassanid king Shapur I achieved what no one had done before, he captured a Roman emperor alive. Valerian, the man who wore the purple, was humiliated, forced to kneel before a foreign king, and used as a footstool by Shapur when mounting his horse. The news sent shockwaves through the Roman Empire. The mighty legions had been defeated, not by barbarians, but by a sophisticated, organized empire that matched them in every way. For the Silk Road, this was a seismic shift. The balance of power had tilted decisively in favor of the East. Rome, the great consumer of silk, was now at the mercy of its most bitter enemy. Every bolt of silk that arrived in Rome now carried the bitter taste of humiliation. But even in this dark hour, the Romans were not idle. They were desperate, and desperation breeds innovation. The question was, what could they possibly do to break the Sassanid stranglehold? But while the Sassanids were celebrating their victory, a quiet revolution was brewing far to the east, on the other side of their empire. For centuries, the vast expanse of Central Asia had been a patchwork of city-states and nomadic tribes. But now, a new force was connecting them, the Sogdians. These weren't just merchants anymore, they were the intellectual middlemen of the world. They carried more than just silk, they carried ideas. And the most powerful idea they carried was religion. Buddhism had already traveled east. Now, a different branch of Christianity, known as Nestorianism, began its long journey west. It was a faith that had been branded a heresy in Rome, but in the East, it found a home. Nestorian monks, skilled in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, established monasteries along the Silk Road. They translated Greek texts into Syriac and then into Persian. They were the living libraries of the ancient world. For the Sassanids, these Christians were a bridge to the west, a source of information and a potential fifth column within their empire. For the Romans, they were a lifeline. The Sogdians, ever the pragmatists, facilitated this exchange. They didn't care about theology, they cared about trade. And in this crucible of ideas, the most precious secret of the East was about to become a target. This new exchange of ideas was happening under the very nose of the Sassanid Empire, which was so focused on military might that it underestimated the power of a simple, silent traveler. The Sassanids were masters of the direct route, controlling the main roads and ports. But the Silk Road was never just one road. It was a web of paths, and the most intriguing of them all was the maritime route. From the ports of the Persian Gulf, ships laden with goods sailed down the coast of Arabia and across the Indian Ocean. This was a route that bypassed the Sassanid tolls entirely. It was slower and more dangerous, but for the Romans, it was a beacon of hope. They began to cultivate alliances with the kingdoms of Arabia and Ethiopia, creating a network of trade that circumvented their Persian enemies. They traded gold for spices, pearls, and, most importantly, for Chinese silk that had been shipped through Indian ports. The Sassanids watched this with growing alarm. Their monopoly was being chipped away. They tried to launch a navy to cut off this route, but the sea was a different battlefield, and they were outmaneuvered by the seasoned sailors of the region. The Roman economy, starved of direct access, was finding a lifeline. The question was no longer if Rome would get silk, but how much it would cost, and what secrets it would bring back with it. The sea routes were a blow to the Sassanids, but they were still making a fortune on land. The overland trade was still the main artery of commerce, and they controlled it with an iron fist. Their cities, like Ctesiphon, were wonderlands of wealth, filled with goods from every corner of the known world. But in the shadow of this opulence, a new kind of weapon was being forged. It wasn't a sword or a siege engine. It was a story. The story of the East, of its wonders, its riches, and its ultimate secret, the source of silk. The Romans had known for centuries that silk came from the mysterious land of the Assyrians. But they had no idea how it was made. They spun elaborate myths about it growing on trees or being combed from the leaves of strange plants. The Sassanids, of course, knew the truth. But they had guarded it fiercely, knowing that the secret was their ultimate leverage over the West. Yet, secrets have a way of becoming known. Every traveler, every merchant, every monk who made the journey from China to the West carried a piece of the puzzle. And in the 6th century AD, a man appeared who was determined to put all the pieces together for the Roman Emperor Justinian. He was a monk, an historian, who had lived in China and knew the secret of the silkworm. He understood that the fate of empires could be changed by a single, tiny creature. The story goes that this monk, whose name history has largely forgotten, came before the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. He promised the emperor that he could break the Sassanid monopoly forever. He had a plan so audacious it seemed impossible. He and a companion would return to the Far East, to the source of the silk, and they would bring back the secret. Not in a book, not in a scroll, but in the most fragile of containers, the hollow core of their walking sticks. In the heart of the bamboo, they would hide the eggs of the silkworm. It was a risk that could cost them their lives. If they were caught, the Chinese would execute them for treason. But they believed their mission was holy. They were not just stealing a trade secret, they were breaking a monopoly that was strangling their world. They made the long, perilous journey east, through Sogdiana and into the heart of China. They lived there for months, learning the intricate art of silkworm cultivation, the feeding of the mulberry leaves, the delicate process of unwinding the cocoon. They waited for the perfect moment, gathered the tiny, almost invisible eggs, and hid them. Then, they began the journey back. It was a race against time. The eggs were alive, and they needed to be kept at the right temperature to survive. They were carrying not just a secret, but the spark of a new industry, a new economy, and a new destiny for the West. The journey back was a desperate gamble. They avoided main roads and well-guarded caravanserais, camping in the wild, keeping their bamboo staves close at all times. The eggs would need to survive the freezing nights of the Pamir Mountains and the scorching days of the desert. Miraculously, they made it. They crossed the border into the Byzantine Empire, their precious cargo intact. When they finally presented the bamboo staves to Emperor Justinian, the eggs were still alive. Under the careful supervision of the emperor's agents, the eggs were hatched, and a new industry was born. Within a few years, the Byzantine Empire had its own silk production, weaving its own purple-dyed silks that would become the envy of the world. The Sassanid monopoly was shattered. The mighty gatekeeper had been outmaneuvered, not by an army, but by 2 monks and a walk. The secret of the East was now the property of the West. This single act of industrial espionage shifted the axis of world commerce and power. It didn't destroy the Silk Road, but it changed its very nature forever. The world was now connected in a new way, a web of shared secrets and stolen technologies. And the Silk Road, once a conduit for luxury goods, had become a pipeline for the most valuable currency of all, knowledge. And this new pipeline was about to flow with more than just silk. The shockwaves of that stolen secret hit Constantinople and Ctesiphon like a thunderclap. The Sassanid Shah, Kavadai, watched in fury as Byzantine looms began weaving silk that once only his merchants could trade. The economic foundation of his empire was crumbling. He knew that a direct assault on the Byzantine heartland would be a desperate gamble, but what choice did he have? He saw the new silk wealth flowing into his enemies' coffers, funding their armies and their grand projects. So, in 502 AD, he did what any cornered emperor would do. He ordered his armies to march west, into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. The pretext was a dispute over the Caucasus, but the real reason was silk. He was going to take back what he believed was rightfully his, by force. This was not just a border skirmish, it was the opening salvo of a new, devastating war. The war that followed was brutal and destructive, but it wasn't the cataclysmic clash that would break either empire. After years of back and forth, a fragile peace was signed. Yet, the underlying tension remained, a poisoned well. The Sassanids were no longer the sole gatekeepers of silk, and this forced them to look for new ways to control the lucrative trade routes. They turned their gaze south, to the Arabian Peninsula, and to the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. They made alliances with the Aksumite kingdom in Africa, and they clashed with them over control of the trade in spices and incense. The world was becoming more complex, more interconnected, and the lines of commerce were shifting. The old certainties of the Silk Road were gone. The Persian Empire, once the unchallenged middleman, was now just one player in a much larger, more dangerous game. And from the chaos, a new kind of leader was about to emerge from the Byzantine ranks, a man who would carve his name into history with fire and steel. His name was Belisarius. A farmer's son from Thrace, he rose through the ranks of the Byzantine army with a mix of raw talent and unshakable loyalty to his emperor, Justinian. While the king and his court schemed in Constantinople, it was Belisarius who was given the impossible tasks. He was sent to the eastern front to hold back the Sassanid tide, and he did so with a genius for strategy that was almost supernatural. He was outnumbered, often outsupplied, but never outthought. He understood the psychology of his enemies, and he used the terrain, the weather, and even religion as weapons. He didn't just win battles, he broke the will of his adversaries to fight. His victories were so complete, so decisive, that they bought the Byzantine Empire the time it desperately needed to consolidate its power and its new silk industry. But even as he secured the east, the emperor was looking west, dreaming of reconquering the lost provinces of the Roman Empire. And for that monumental task, he would need his greatest general. But while the Mediterranean world was locked in its ancient rivalries, an even greater transformation was taking place in the east. The fragmented kingdoms of China were being unified under a new, dynamic dynasty, the Tang. In 618 AD, a new emperor took the throne, a man named Gaozu. He and his son, Li Shimin, were not just conquerors, they were visionaries. They looked at the Silk Road and saw not a distant trade route, but the aorta of their empire. They understood that controlling the Taklamakan and the Heshi corridor was the key to dominating all of Asia. They launched a series of campaigns to the west, pushing their armies further than even the Han had ever dreamed. City after city, oasis after oasis, fell to their superior cavalry and their brilliant strategies. The name of the Tang Emperor became a legend, a promise of order and prosperity. The Silk Road, once a fragile network of trails, was now a superhighway protected by the most powerful military machine on Earth. And with this security came a golden age of trade and cultural exchange. Under the Tang, the Silk Road reached its zenith. The caravans that crossed the desert were now larger, richer, and more frequent than ever before. And they carried more than just silk. They carried ideas. From India came Buddhism, which was now the dominant religion of the Oasis kingdoms and was even gaining a foothold in China itself. From Persia came new forms of art and music. And from the west, along the very same roads, came new religions. One of the most fascinating was Manichaeism, a complex dualistic faith that had been persecuted in the Roman Empire but found a safe haven in the cosmopolitan cities of the Silk Road. But the most revolutionary export was paper. The Chinese secret, first developed centuries earlier, was finally moving west. The Sogdian merchants, ever the entrepreneurs, carried it in their packs, and soon the knowledge of papermaking was spreading from Samarkand to Baghdad. And with paper came another secret, a dark and powerful one. Gunpowder. The alchemists of the Tang had been experimenting with it for years. It was a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. They thought it was an elixir of life. They were wrong. But the golden age of the Tang was not to last. The very success of the Silk Road would sow the seeds of its greatest challenge. While the empires of the East and West were growing rich on trade, a new power was rising in the deserts of Arabia. A prophet named Muhammad had unified the warring tribes of the peninsula under a single faith, Islam. His followers, driven by a potent mix of religious zeal and economic ambition, were about to explode onto the world stage. They swept out of the desert, and in a generation, they had conquered the Sassanid Empire entirely and stripped the Byzantine Empire of its richest provinces. They were a force of nature, and they would not stop. They looked at the Silk Road, and they saw the prize that had eluded so many before them. The question was not if they would take control of the trade routes, but when. The world was on the brink of a new age, an age where the old powers of Rome and Persia would be eclipsed by a new, dynamic civilization. And the Silk Road, the ancient artery of the world, was about to flow with a new and powerful current. What would this new empire mean for the ancient road of silk? What secrets would they unlock, and what would they destroy? But the storm that came from the south was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The armies of the Rashidun Caliphate didn't just want to trade on the Silk Road. They wanted to own it. In a single generation, they annihilated the Sassanid Empire, an empire that had stood for over 4 centuries. They swept through the Levant and Egypt, tearing the richest provinces from the Byzantine Empire's grasp. And then, they turned their eyes eastward, toward the ancient cities of Merv, Samarkand, and Bokhara. For the merchants and monks of the Silk Road, it was a terrifying time. The old rules were gone. The Sogdian traders, who had dominated the route for 1,000 years, found themselves subjects of a new, uncompromising power. They had to learn a new language, pay new taxes, and answer to new masters. The question that hung in the air was simple: would this new empire be the end of the Silk Road, or the beginning of its most glorious, and most dangerous, chapter yet? The answer, surprisingly, was not destruction. The early caliphs were warriors, but they were also pragmatists. They saw the Silk Road not as a foreign entity to be crushed, but as a magnificent engine of wealth to be harnessed. They built upon the existing infrastructure, the caravanserais, the wells, the trading posts, and they imposed their own order. The new rulers, the Umayyads, established their capital in Damascus, and from there, they controlled the western end of the trade network. They conquered the Sogdian cities, and the Sogdians, ever adaptable, became the tax collectors and administrators for their new masters. But it was more than just conquest. The Umayyads were creating a new civilization, an Islamic civilization that stretched from Spain to India. And at its heart was a voracious appetite for knowledge. They were not just interested in gold and silk. They wanted to understand the world. They translated Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and Indian mathematics. The Silk Road was no longer just a route for goods. It was a route for ideas, and the Muslim world was becoming the greatest library humanity had ever known. But this new Islamic civilization was not a single, monolithic block. Power shifted. The Umayyads, with their capital in Damascus, were overthrown by a new dynasty, the Abbasids, who moved the center of the Islamic world further east, to a brand new city on the Tigris River, Baghdad. This was a masterstroke. Baghdad was not just a political capital, it was a city built on trade, perfectly positioned to dominate the Silk Road. The Abbasids were even more devoted to knowledge than their predecessors. They established the House of Wisdom, a grand library and translation center where scholars from all over the world gathered. They translated the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen. They adopted the Indian system of numerals, what we call Arabic numerals today, and the concept of zero, which revolutionized mathematics. From papermaking to astronomy, from medicine to chemistry, the Abbasids were the intellectual giants of the age. And all of this knowledge was flowing, like the silk itself, along the ancient roads. The Silk Road was no longer just connecting East and West. It was becoming the intellectual spinal cord of the world. Meanwhile, back in the East, the Tang dynasty was watching this new power with growing unease. They had seen the Arabs conquer the Sassanids and sweep through Central Asia, absorbing the Sogdian city-states that had been Tang vassals. The two great empires of the age, the Tang and the Abbasids, were now face to face, their spheres of influence colliding in the fertile valleys of Transoxiana, the land between the rivers. For years, they were content to trade and negotiate, but the tension was palpable. It was a cold war, fought with alliances and money, not just with armies. The Tang supported any local ruler who would resist the Arab advance, while the Abbasids did the same. The Silk Road, which had always been a conduit for goods, now became a frontier. It was a high-stakes game of chess, and the prize was control of the entire world's trade. And then, in 751 AD, the game exploded into open conflict. It happened at a place called the Talas River, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The Tang army, a massive force of professional soldiers, marched west to confront the Abbasid army. It was a battle that would decide the fate of Central Asia, and the future of the Silk Road itself. The Battle of Talas was a brutal, bloody affair. The Tang army, known for its discipline and its powerful crossbowmen, initially had the upper hand. But the battle was not decided by skill or courage. It was decided by betrayal. The Tang army included a large contingent of Turkic mercenaries from the Karluk tribe. Midway through the battle, they switched sides, turning their swords on their Tang allies. The Tang army was caught in a devastating pincer movement and was utterly annihilated. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Tang dynasty. They lost not only the battle but also their influence over Central Asia forever. The Abbasids, however, had won a victory of unimaginable consequence. But their most valuable prize was not gold, nor land, nor even the submission of the local princes. It was prisoners of war. Among the thousands of captives taken at Talas were skilled Chinese artisans. And among those artisans were the keepers of one of China's most guarded secrets, the knowledge of papermaking. The secret that the Chinese had guarded for centuries, the secret that had made their civilization so advanced, was now in the hands of their enemies. And it was about to spread across the Islamic world like wildfire. And what a wildfire it was! Samarkand, the city where the prisoners were sent, became the first great center of papermaking outside of China. Soon, mills were springing up in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The world of parchment and papyrus was over. Paper was cheaper, easier to make, and more durable. It was the world's first true mass communication technology. But the Battle of Talas was more than just a transfer of technology. It was a turning point in world history. It sealed the fate of Central Asia, making it a permanent part of the Islamic world. It broke the power of the Tang dynasty in the West, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Chinese Golden Age. The Silk Road was now firmly under Muslim control. The old powers of the East, the Tang, would soon be shattered by internal rebellion. The road itself, once a conduit for Chinese silk and Roman gold, was now the highway of a new, dynamic, and powerful civilization. But the Abbasids had won a poisoned chalice. As they grew rich on trade, the very fabric of their empire began to unravel. Provincial governors grew powerful. New dynasties broke away. The Silk Road, which had made Baghdad the greatest city on earth, was also creating the forces that would tear it apart. The question was no longer who would control the road, but if the road itself could survive the chaos. Who would be the next to rise from the ashes? With the Tang broken in the west and the Abbasids ascendant, a new golden age dawned. But it wasn't in China. It was in Baghdad. Under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the city became the richest, most cultured metropolis on earth. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and gold flowed through its gates. Scholars translated the works of Aristotle and the mathematics of India. Poets recited verses in marble palaces. Baghdad was the center of the known world. But a dark shadow fell across this glittering court. The very wealth that fueled this renaissance was creating a dangerous dependence. The Abbasids needed the Silk Road open. They needed the merchants to keep coming. But the road was long, and the desert was unforgiving. And at the edges of the empire, far from the caliph's gaze, new forces were stirring. Forces that didn't care about poetry or philosophy. Forces that would soon test the power of the caliphate in ways no one could imagine. The Abbasid thirst for luxury and power fueled a demand for exotic goods, and the Silk Road answered. But the road itself was changing. The old overland routes through Central Asia remained vital, but new arteries were pumping lifeblood into the caliphate. From the east came paper and porcelain. From the south came gold, ivory, and slaves. And from the north, a strange new flow began. A flow of silver, furs, and a very particular kind of slave, the Sakalaba, the fair-skinned people of the northern lands. These were the people the Vikings called the Rus. They were fierce warriors, but also brilliant traders. They navigated the great rivers of Russia, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, bringing their wares to the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate. They were pagans, but they were pragmatic. They were barbarians, but they were indispensable. And in the courts of Baghdad, whispers of these northerners began to grow. Who were these people who came from the land of ice and darkness? What secrets did they hold? But even as the silver flowed south, the seeds of the Abbasids' destruction were being sown within their own walls. The caliphs, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, grew soft. They became reliant on slave soldiers, Turks and Sakalaba, to guard their thrones. These were men with no loyalty to the people, only to their commanders. They were mercenaries, and they were dangerous. Meanwhile, provincial governors, enriched by the trade that flowed through their territories, began to act like independent kings. They built their own palaces, raised their own armies, and paid only lip service to Baghdad. The caliphate was becoming a hollow shell. The Silk Road, which had created this vast, wealthy empire, was now revealing its fatal flaw. It wasn't a single road, but a web of connections. And if any single thread was cut, the entire web could unravel. The question was no longer when the caliphate would collapse, but who would be the one to pull the thread. While the caliphate decayed from within, a new power was rising in the far north, a power born from the cold and the sea. The Vikings. For centuries, they had been raiders, striking fear into the hearts of monks and villagers across Europe. But they were also explorers and traders. They had discovered Iceland, Greenland, and even a new world across the Atlantic. But their greatest achievement was the creation of a vast trading network that stretched from the shores of North America to the heart of Asia. Their longships, sleek and fast, could sail up rivers as easily as across oceans. They founded cities like Novgorod and Kiev, and they established a trade route that would link the Baltic to the Caspian and the Black Seas. These were the men who would bring the furs of the northern forests and the silver of the east together. They were the new masters of the Northern Silk Road, and they were about to enter the world stage in a way that would change everything. But the Vikings were not just traders and raiders. They were also settlers and state builders. In the vast, flat lands of Eastern Europe, they established a ruling class known as the Varangians, or the Rus. They mixed with the local Slavic population, creating a new people and a new identity. They built strongholds and taxed the trade routes that passed through their territory. From their new capital in Kiev, they controlled the Dnieper River, the vital highway to Byzantium. They became so powerful that Byzantine emperors hired them as their personal bodyguards, the famous Varangian Guard. These were tall, blonde warriors, loyal only to the emperor and willing to die for him. The Vikings, once the terror of the seas, were now the mercenaries and kings of the East. They had carved out a new empire for themselves, not with the sword alone, but with a keen understanding of trade. And at the heart of their power was the silver that flowed from the East, the silver of the Silk Road. So here we are, in the 9th and 10th centuries, with the Silk Road reshaped by forces the old world could never have predicted. The Caliphate of the Abbasids, once the pinnacle of civilization, is rotting from within, its power fading. The Tang dynasty in the East is a shadow of its former self, broken by rebellion and internal strife. And rising in the north, a new power, the Rus, the people of the rivers, who owe their strength not to the desert and the camel, but to the forest and the longship. They are the new gatekeepers of the East-West trade. The old masters of the road are dying. A new order is emerging from the frozen north. The question now is not who will control the road, but what will happen when these two worlds collide. When the pagan Rus meet the established empires of the south, what will be the price of their trade? And what secrets will they carry with them, down the rivers, to the glittering cities of Byzantium, and beyond? The stage is set for a confrontation that will define the next era of world history. But who were these Rus, really? They were not a single tribe, but a mix of Swedish Vikings, Slavic farmers, and Finnic hunters, bound together by the rivers. They moved on the waterways, not the steppes. Their ships were not the towering cogs of the North Sea, but shallow-draft boats that could navigate the swift currents of the Dnieper and the Volga. Their greatest city, Kiev, was not a fortress of stone, but a bustling trading post on a high bluff above the river. They called the Dnieper the road to the Greeks, and every spring, they would push their boats south, loaded with furs, honey, and slaves. Their real treasure, though, was the silver they got from the east. They were the new middlemen, and they understood the game better than anyone. They knew that the true power lay not in what you produced, but in what you controlled. And they controlled the very arteries of the world's trade. To the south, on the steppes between the Rus and the great empires, lay the realm of the Khazars. For over a century, they had been the silent power of the Silk Road. They were a Turkic people who had converted to Judaism, creating a unique state that held the key to the East-West trade. Their capital, Adil, was a vast city of tents and markets at the mouth of the Volga, where merchants from Baghdad met traders from Novgorod. They were the gatekeepers of the southern route, and they charged a heavy toll for the privilege of passing through their land. The Rus and the Khazars were natural rivals, each vying for control of the lucrative trade. The Khazars, with their cavalry and their wealth, had the advantage. But the Rus had something else, ambition, and a hunger for the riches of the East that no toll could quench. This simmering tension would not last forever. A clash was inevitable, and it would change the face of the Silk Road forever. The Khazar Khaganate was a paradox. They were a pagan, tribal people who adopted the Torah. They were a warrior state that protected religious tolerance. They were the shield of Europe, holding back the Umayyad armies from the south, and yet they were also the masters of a vast trade network that enriched their enemies. Their power was built on control. They controlled the Volga, the Don, and the trade routes that crossed the steppes. They levied taxes on every caravan, every ship, every bale of silk and bundle of fur. They were the undisputed lords of the region, and their army was a formidable force of heavy cavalry. But their power was based on a fragile balance. They relied on the trade from the east, and they relied on the fear they instilled in their neighbors. The Rus, though, were growing bolder. They saw the Khazar wealth, and they wanted it for themselves. They saw the Khazar control, and they wanted to break it. The seeds of a conflict were sown, a conflict that would not be a simple raid, but a war for the very soul of the Silk Road. But the Khazars were not the only power in the region. To the west, the Byzantine Empire was still the richest and most civilized state in Europe. Its capital, Constantinople, was a golden city that seemed to be from another world. The Rus knew of its splendor, and they both coveted and feared it. They called it Miklagard, the great city. They had attacked it before, sailing their longships down the Bosphorus, but the city's massive walls had held. The Byzantines, for their part, saw the Rus as both a threat and an opportunity. They were dangerous barbarians, but they were also a valuable ally against the Khazars and the Arabs. So the Byzantines played a dangerous game. They would send missionaries to convert the Rus to Christianity, hoping to tame them. They would also hire them as mercenaries, turning their ferocity into a weapon for the empire. The Rus were a wild card, and the Byzantines were trying to control them, to pull them into their orbit of civilization and diplomacy. But in doing so, they were also exposing themselves to a force they could not fully understand. Yet, the most dangerous threat to the old order was not coming from the battlefield, but from the marketplace. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was still the world's greatest economy, and its silver dirhams were the global currency. But the Caliphate was beginning to fracture, and its control over the eastern provinces was weakening. In the distant city of Samarkand, a new dynasty, the Samanids, was rising to power. They were Persian, not Arab, and they were fiercely independent. They controlled the fertile valleys of Transoxiana, and they were the new masters of the eastern trade. The Samanids were the link between the Turkic steppes and the Muslim world, and they were growing rich on the slave trade and the silver mines of Central Asia. It was from their mines that the silver came that flowed into the hands of the Rus. This silver was the lifeblood of the northern trade, and it was creating a new economy in the forests of the north, an economy that was independent of the old Silk Road routes. A new world was being born, fueled by silver and slaves, and it was centered not on the deserts of the east, but on the rivers of the north. And so, the stage was set for a new and even more dangerous game. The old masters of the Silk Road, the Abbasids and the Byzantines, were on the defensive. The new players, the Rus and the Samanids, were on the rise. But there was another force gathering in the east, a force that would soon sweep across the steppes and change everything. It was the sound of hoofbeats, the sound of 1,000 horses. It was the rise of a new nomadic power from the northern steppes of Mongolia, a people known as the Khitans. They were not yet a threat to the west, but they were a shadow on the horizon. And in the shadows, another secret was being kept, a secret that could topple a kingdom. For the Rus, their greatest weapon was not their swords, but their knowledge of the waterways. They knew every river, every portage, every rapid. They knew how to move an army faster than any horseman. The question that now hung in the air was not if these powers would collide, but when. What would happen when the Rus' ambition met the Khazars' greed, and the Byzantines' pride? What would be the fate of a world that was shrinking, a world connected by a fragile web of silk and silver, a web that was about to be torn apart? But before that storm could break, a single man would try to hold the world together. He was a merchant, a traveler, an explorer. His name was Ibn Fadlan. He was a scholar and a diplomat, sent by the Caliph of Baghdad to the king of the Bulgars, a distant people on the Volga. His mission was to spread Islam, but his journey would become something far more important. His journey would take him into the heart of the Viking world, to a people he had never imagined. He would witness their strange customs, their brutal rituals, and their unquenchable thirst for trade. He would write it all down, in meticulous detail, creating a unique and priceless window into the world of the Rus. His story is a story of a world on the verge of transformation, a world where a Muslim scholar from Baghdad would become the first European to describe the people who would one day rule Russia. And his journey would reveal a secret that no one in the south had fully grasped, the true extent of the northern people's connection to the Silk Road, and their willingness to do anything to control it. What did he see on those distant rivers? He saw a people who were both terrifying and fascinating. He described their physical perfection and their filth, their generosity and their cruelty. He witnessed a ship burial of a chieftain, a ceremony of blood and fire that was unlike anything he had ever seen. He saw how they worshipped their gods, and how they valued their silver. He saw that they were not just barbarians, but a complex people with their own laws, their own art, and their own vision of the world. He saw that their power came not from the land, but from the river, and that their true god was the prophet. He saw that the Rus were the new masters of the north, and that their web of trade reached to the very ends of the earth. He saw the future, and he was afraid. His journey to the Volga would prove that the Silk Road was no longer just a road of the East. It had become a world system, a network that connected the frozen north to the burning deserts of Arabia. And at its heart, a new and dangerous power was rising. A power that would not play by the old rules. A power that would one day threaten the walls of Constantinople itself. But that story, the story of what Ibn Fadlan saw, and what it would lead to, is a story for another day. For now, remember this, the world was changing, and the old powers were blind to the new storm gathering on the horizon. The question is, were you listening? And if you want to know what happened when the Rus finally came to the gates of the great city, when their ships appeared on the horizon, and when the world they built would be sealed in blood and fire, then you need to stay with us. What will the Rus do with their newfound power? What will happen when they meet the true might of the Byzantine Empire? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter of the Silk Road's history. But the world Ibn Fadlan described, that violent, fractured world of warring tribes and rival kingdoms, was about to be swept away by a force no one saw coming. Imagine the steppes of Central Asia, a sea of grass stretching beyond the horizon, where life is a constant struggle for survival. Here, amidst the clans and the blood feuds, a boy named Temujin was born into a world of chaos. His father was poisoned, his family abandoned, his future bleak. But Temujin was not like the others. He possessed a cold, calculating intelligence and a ruthless ambition that would unite the warring tribes under a single banner. He took a new name, Genghis Khan, which means, universal ruler, and he promised his followers the wealth of the world. The Silk Road, with its caravans of gold, silk, and spices, was the prize he coveted. He understood that to control trade was to control the world. The old powers of the East and West, so focused on their own squabbles, had no idea that the greatest storm in history was about to break upon them all. Genghis Khan's revolution was not just about conquest, it was about a new kind of warfare. His army, organized into highly disciplined units called Tumans, was a machine built for speed and terror. They didn't just fight, they destroyed. Cities that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations put to the sword or sold into slavery. The news of their brutality spread faster than their horses, and many cities surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid the fate of their neighbors. But Genghis Khan was also a brilliant administrator. He understood that you couldn't rule an empire on fear alone. He broke the power of the traditional tribal aristocracy and promoted men based on merit, not birth. He created a new legal code, the Yasa, which imposed strict discipline and order across his growing domain. And crucially, he opened the trade routes. For the first time in centuries, a single authority controlled the entire length of the Silk Road from China to Persia. A merchant could travel from one end of the empire to the other without fear of bandits, as long as they carried the Khan's passport. The world was about to become a much smaller place. This new era of security and unification was a golden age for those who dared to travel. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Persia now mingled with traders from China and India in bustling caravanserais. Ideas, inventions, and religions flowed along the routes with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder, the printing press, the compass, and paper money, all these wonders of the East began to trickle westward, forever changing the course of European history. But this exchange was not limited to goods and technology. The Mongols were remarkably tolerant of all religions. They had Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and even Taoists at their court. They sought to understand the spiritual beliefs of their subjects, not to suppress them. This created an atmosphere of intellectual curiosity and exchange that had never been seen before. It was a time when the East and West were truly looking at each other for the first time, not as enemies, but as potential partners in a vast, interconnected world. The Silk Road was no longer just a route for silk, it was the beating heart of the world economy. And into this new world stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with Silk Road adventure, Marco Polo. In 1271, a young Venetian merchant, just 17 years old, set out with his father and uncle on a journey that would last 24 years. They traveled through the treacherous mountains of Central Asia, across the Gobi Desert, and into the heart of the Mongol Empire, to the court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis. Marco was not just a tourist. He was intelligent, observant, and fluent in several languages. He entered the Khan's service and traveled extensively throughout China, marveling at its cities, its wealth, and its technology. He saw paper money, which Europeans thought was absurd. He saw coal burning, which they thought was a legend. He described a world so advanced and so wealthy that when his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, was published, most Europeans simply didn't believe him. His stories of a land of fabulous wealth, of cities with millions of people, and of a Khan whose power was absolute, seemed like pure fantasy. But for those who listened, it was a revelation that would ignite the imagination of a continent. But the Mongol Empire was too vast, too diverse, and too dependent on the will of a single man to last forever. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons. This giant, unified state began to fracture into four separate khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. For a while, they maintained the Pax Mongolica, but the bonds of kinship soon gave way to rivalry and suspicion. The Silk Road, once a single highway, became a patchwork of competing territories, each with its own tariffs and its own political agenda. The unity that had made the road so prosperous was crumbling. The stage was set for the greatest crisis of the Mongol world, a conflict that would not be between the Mongols and the outside world, but a bitter civil war within the family itself. A war that would pit brother against brother and decide the fate of the Silk Road for centuries to come. The Golden Age was ending, and the world was about to enter a period of chaos and darkness once more. The cracks in the empire became open wounds. The Ilkhanate in Persia, wealthy and powerful, was the first to break away from the authority of the Great Khan in China. They embraced Islam and formed alliances with European powers against their own Mongol cousins. The Golden Horde, to the north, remained shamanistic and allied with the enemies of the Ilkhanate. The Silk Road, the very thing that had united the Mongols, became the prize in a bitter family war. Control of the trade routes meant control of the world's wealth, and both sides were willing to spill endless blood to claim it. The security that merchants had enjoyed for a century evaporated. Caravans were raided, cities were sacked, and the roads were once again dangerous. The great experiment of the Pax Mongolica was failing. The world was splitting apart, and the peace and prosperity it had known were fading like a dream. The question was no longer who would control the Silk Road, but who would destroy it. The world stood on the brink of a new dark age, and the very survival of this ancient network of trade and ideas was hanging by a thread. The next chapter in the story of the Silk Road would be written not by conquerors, but by those who survived the chaos. What happened when the empire of Genghis Khan turned on itself? What secrets were lost in the fire and the blood? And what new powers would emerge from the ashes? The old order was dying, and history was about to take a terrifying turn. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss what happens when the Silk Road's greatest empire collapses into civil war and the world is plunged into darkness. The world watched as the sons of Genghis Khan tore each other apart. But from this chaos, a new figure emerged, a man whose name would become a curse across the Islamic world, Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan. He was given the wealthiest prize of all, the Ilkhanate of Persia. But Hulagu wasn't just a ruler, he was a destroyer. He looked at the ancient city of Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, the beating heart of Islamic learning and culture, and he saw only an obstacle. In 1258, he laid siege to it. With his army of warriors and the latest Chinese siege engines, the walls crumbled. But the horrors that followed were beyond anything the city had seen. The streets ran red with blood. The libraries, the stores of knowledge accumulated over centuries, were thrown into the Tigris, turning the river black with ink. Baghdad, once the center of the world, fell into ashes. The old world was truly dead, and the new one was built on a mountain of skulls. The fall of Baghdad wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological blow that shattered the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, was executed, trampled to death by horses. For centuries, he had been a figure of authority, a symbol of unity. With him gone, the Muslim world was left without a center, splintered and vulnerable. The Mongols continued their rampage, sweeping through Syria, sacking Aleppo and Damascus. It seemed that nothing could stand in their way. But wait, the story of the Silk Road is never that simple. For out of the ashes of the old order, a new power was rising, a slave army that would become the stuff of legend. These were the Mamluks, warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, who had been brought to Egypt as slaves but had risen to become the rulers of the land. They were hardened fighters, trained from childhood in the art of war. And they saw the Mongol advance not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Their leader was a man named Kutuz. He knew that the Mongols were not invincible. He knew that they could be beaten. Kutuz knew he couldn't face the Mongols alone. He needed allies. He sent envoys to the Christians, the Crusaders who still held a fragile grip on the coastal cities of the Levant. It was a bizarre alliance, enemies of the enemy. The Christians, who had suffered their own defeats at the hands of the Mongols, were hesitant. But they eventually allowed the Mamluk army to pass through their lands. The two forces finally met at a spring in the Jezreel Valley, a place called Ein Jalut, the Spring of Goliath. The date was September 3, 1260. The Mongol army, led by a general named Kitbuka, was confident, arrogant. They saw the Mamluks as just another rabble to be crushed. But Kutuz had a plan. He laid a trap. He hid a large part of his army in the hills while his main force pretended to retreat. The Mongols, eager for victory, charged forward in pursuit. And then, the trap was sprung. The hidden Mamluk cavalry burst out from the hills, hitting the Mongols from both sides. The battle turned into a slaughter. Ein Jalut was a turning point in world history. It was the first time the Mongols had been decisively defeated in a major battle. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. The Mongol general Kitbuka was captured and executed. Kutuz, the victor, rode into Damascus and Aleppo, restoring them to Muslim rule. But victory was fleeting. On the way back to Cairo, Kutuz was assassinated by his own subordinate, a man named Baybars, who seized the throne for himself. Baybars was a ruthless and brilliant ruler. He transformed the Mamluks into a formidable empire, a bulwark against both the Mongols and the remaining Crusaders. He knew that the Silk Road, and its wealth, was the key to power. Under his rule, Cairo became a new center of trade and power, a rival to anything the Mongols could offer. The world of the Silk Road was changing. The Mongols were no longer the only game in town. A new power had emerged, and it was here to stay. But what about the man who started it all? Hulagu, the conqueror of Baghdad, was furious. He had lost a battle, and he had lost his reputation. He vowed to return and crush the Mamluks, to avenge his general and his pride. He sent envoys to the new Sultan Baybars, demanding his submission. Baybars responded in the most brutal way possible. He killed the envoys and had their heads hung on the gates of Cairo. It was a declaration of war. But Hulagu was distracted by the politics of the Mongol Empire. He was dealing with threats from his own cousins, the Golden Horde, and the Chagatai Khanate. The internal divisions of the Mongol world were now playing out on a global stage. The Silk Road was a divided highway, with different powers controlling different parts, each with its own agenda. The unity of the Pax Mongolica was gone. In its place was a new, vicious, and multipolar world. The age of the great Khanates was over. The age of the warlords had begun. The Mongol world was in chaos, but the story of the Silk Road was far from over. The Mamluks, under Baybars, were rebuilding the trade networks that had been destroyed. They forged alliances with the remnants of the Crusader states, and even with the Golden Horde, against their common enemy, Hulagu. Cairo was becoming a melting pot of cultures, a place where merchants from Europe, Africa, and Asia met to exchange goods and ideas. It was a new Silk Road, one that bypassed the old centers of power. The question was no longer who would rule the world from a single throne. The question was whether the world could survive the chaos. But a young Venetian merchant, perhaps a man named Marco Polo, was watching all of this from the eastern Mediterranean. He would soon take a journey that would give the West a glimpse of a world they could barely imagine. And what happened in the court of Kublai Khan would be more fantastical than any legend. Did he truly serve the great Khan? Or was his story a grand deception that would change the course of history? Subscribe and hit the bell to find out, because the greatest adventure on the Silk Road is only just beginning. Baybars knew he couldn't just wait for Hulagu's revenge. He had to strike first, to shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility once and for all. In 1277, he marched his armies into Anatolia, deep into territory controlled by the Ilkhanate. At the Battle of Elbistan, he faced a Mongol army led by General Tutuan. The Mamluks, hardened by years of desert warfare, fought with a ferocity that surprised even their own commanders. They broke the Mongol lines and chased them from the field. It was a stunning victory, a second Ain Jalut. But Baybars knew he couldn't hold the ground. He was too far from his supply lines, and Hulagu's successor, Abaka, was already gathering a massive army for revenge. Baybars made the bitter choice to withdraw, leaving Anatolia to be ravaged by the Mongols in retaliation. He returned to Cairo a hero, but a troubled one. He had won the battle, but he could see the war was far from over. But while Baybars was fighting in the north, a new threat was brewing in the east. The Chagatai Khanate, the Mongol state that controlled Central Asia, was not content to sit on the sidelines. Their Khan, Barak, was a ruthless opportunist. He saw the Ilkhanate's weakness and decided to invade Khorasan, hoping to carve out a piece of the empire for himself. This was a moment of utter chaos. The Mongol Empire, which had once stretched from Korea to Poland, was now tearing itself apart in a series of brutal civil wars. The Silk Road, which had enjoyed a brief golden age under Kublai Khan, was now a highway of armies and refugees. Merchants had to pay tribute to a dozen different warlords, and even then, they were not safe. Caravans were looted, cities were sacked, and the dreams of a connected world seemed to be dying in a sea of blood. But even in this darkness, a light was flickering far to the west, a light that would soon guide a young Venetian across the entire continent. That young Venetian was, of course, Marco Polo. But before he could reach the court of Kublai Khan, he had to survive the journey of a lifetime. Leaving Acre in 1271, he and his father and uncle traveled through the Levant, into Armenia, and down into the heart of the Middle East. They passed through Baghdad, a city still recovering from the sack of Hulagu. The streets were filled with rubble, and the great libraries were nothing but ash. But the merchants were still there, picking up the pieces, desperate to rebuild their lives. Marco watched as they traded spices, silks, and precious stones, all under the watchful eyes of the Mongol conquerors. He saw a world in transition, a world where the old empires had crumbled and new powers were struggling to be born. Every city had a different ruler, a different language, and a different religion. And yet, the goods kept flowing. The demand for silk and spice was too strong, too deeply ingrained in the human desire for luxury. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network of stubborn human connections that refused to be broken. But the Polo family was not just traveling for adventure. They were on a mission. They carried letters and gifts from the Pope to Kublai Khan, the great Mongol emperor. They journeyed through Persia, where they saw the remnants of the once great Ilkhanate. They crossed the harsh deserts of Central Asia, following the ancient caravan routes that had been used for centuries. They faced sandstorms, bandits, and freezing temperatures. They saw the bones of animals and people who had not been so lucky. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape. But Marco was captivated. He was a born storyteller, and he filled his notebooks with observations of strange customs, exotic animals, and powerful kings. He was seeing the world in a way that almost no European had ever seen it. He was walking the path of Alexander the Great, of the Persian emperors, of the Chinese dynasties. And with every step, he was becoming a living bridge between East and West. The question was, would his story ever make it back home? Meanwhile, back in Cairo, the great Sultan Baybars was facing his own demons. He had built an empire from the ashes of the Ayyubid dynasty, but he was paranoid. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He had murdered the previous sultan, Qutuz, to take the throne, and he lived in constant fear that someone would do the same to him. He was a brilliant military commander, but he was also a ruthless tyrant. He eliminated anyone he saw as a threat, including his own sons. He forged alliances with the Golden Horde, a move that angered the Ilkhanate and created a complex web of international politics. He was also a patron of the arts and architecture, building grand mosques and schools that still stand today. But his greatest obsession was the fight against the Mongols. He knew that their revenge was inevitable. He spent his final years preparing for the coming storm, strengthening his army, and building fortifications. But death came for him in 1277, not on the battlefield, but from a simple illness. The man who had stopped the Mongol horde was gone. The question of who would succeed him would plunge the Mamluk Sultanate into a new crisis. But death was not the end of the story. Baybars's legacy lived on, as did the Silk Road. The Mamluks, now under new leadership, continued to thrive as the middlemen between the Mediterranean and the East. They traded with the Genoese, the Venetians, and the Catalans, bringing the luxuries of Asia to the hungry markets of Europe. But the road was changing. The Pax Mongolica was a fading memory. The world was becoming more fragmented, more dangerous, and more complex. It was in this world that Marco Polo was about to achieve his greatest goal. He was walking into the court of Kublai Khan, the most powerful man on earth. He would present himself as a servant of the great Khan, and he would spend the next 17 years in his service. He would travel to the far corners of China, see inventions that Europe couldn't even dream of, and return with a story so fantastic that no one would truly believe him. But as he knelt before the great Khan, he made a choice that would echo through the ages. The question is, was it a choice born of truth, or of a grand and magnificent deception? That secret, hidden for centuries, is the key to understanding the entire age. And to uncover it, we must follow the young Venetian into the heart of the Mongol Empire. Subscribe now, and hit the bell, so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. The Sultan was dead. Baybars, the man who had crushed the Mongols at Ain Jalut, was gone. But his paranoia had left a poison in the heart of the Mamluk state. His sons were weak, his generals were ambitious, and the throne was a prize waiting to be claimed. For 3 years, the Sultanate was torn apart by coups, assassinations, and betrayals. The very fabric of their power was unraveling. And in this chaos, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a man who would define the next chapter of the Silk Road. But while Cairo burned with intrigue, far to the east, a different kind of storm was brewing. The Mongol Empire, once a single, terrifying force, was now a collection of rival khanates, each with its own agenda. The Pax Mongolica was dead. The roads were no longer safe. And into this fractured world, a young Venetian stepped forward, not as a conqueror, but as a traveler with a story so impossible it would change Europe forever. Meanwhile, Marco Polo was crossing the last great mountain range of his journey. He had traveled through the brutal deserts of Persia, the deadly highlands of Pamir, and the vast steppes of Central Asia. He had seen the ruins of ancient cities and the camps of nomadic tribes. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when he finally descended into the plains of China. The cities were enormous, with streets paved in stone and bustling with merchants from every corner of the known world. There was paper money, a concept that was utterly alien to a European. There were printed books, gunpowder, and the most sophisticated postal system in history. It was a civilization so advanced, so prosperous, that Marco Polo would later be accused of lying about everything he saw. But he was not lying. He was merely the first European to see the future. And as he was led to the court of Kublai Khan, he knew that his life was about to change forever. He was not the first European to reach the court of the Khan, but he was the most observant, and the most ambitious. Kublai Khan was not just a conqueror, he was an emperor who understood the power of knowledge. He was fascinated by this Venetian who spoke of a distant Europe, about its kings, its wars, and its strange religion. Marco Polo was young, intelligent, and eager to impress. He learned the languages and customs of the empire quickly. He was assigned to the Khan's service, not as a soldier, but as a diplomat and a spy. He traveled to the far corners of the Yuan Empire, to Yunnan in the south, to the borders of Burma, and even to the coast of the Eastern Sea. He saw things that seemed like magic, black stones that burned like wood, mountains of salt, and rivers teeming with fish. He was living in a world of wonders, and he was documenting it all, not on paper, but in his memory, for a day when he would return home. But he also saw the cracks in this great empire, the simmering resentment of the conquered Chinese, and the growing distance between the Khan and his own people. But in the west, a new danger was rising. While Marco Polo was being seduced by the wonders of Cathay, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that ruled Persia, was in chaos. Its rulers had converted to Islam, and they were locked in a bitter, eternal war with their cousins, the Golden Horde. The Silk Road, which had been unified under Genghis Khan, was now a patchwork of warring states. Caravans were easy targets. Merchants had to hire armies of mercenaries just to survive the journey. But the real threat came from the east. A man named Timur was born into a minor noble family in the Chagatai Khanate, the Central Asian heartland of the Mongol Empire. He was a bandit, a shepherd, and a brilliant military tactician. He had a limp that earned him the name Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane. And he dreamed of one thing, to restore the glory of Genghis Khan, but not as a Mongol. As a Turkic conqueror, he would build an empire that would eclipse them all. He would burn cities to the ground and build pyramids of skulls. And he would do it all in the name of Islam. For Marco Polo, however, the danger was much closer to home. He had become a trusted advisor to the Khan, but his position was precarious. The court was a nest of vipers, filled with Chinese officials who resented the foreign influence, and Mongol nobles who despised the Khan's civilized ways. They saw Polo as an outsider, a spy for a distant king. A single misstep, a single rumor, and he would be executed. He was surrounded by wealth and power, but he was also a prisoner in a golden cage. He had long conversations with the Khan, not just about trade, but about philosophy, religion, and the nature of power. The Khan was a man of great intellect, but he was also a man with a heavy burden. He was the Khan of Khans, the son of heaven, but he was also a man who had ordered the deaths of millions. He was haunted by his own power, and he saw in Polo a man who could understand him, a man from a world so different that he could be trusted. But Polo knew a dangerous secret, a secret about the Khan's family, about a rebellion that was brewing in the south, and about the Khan's greatest fear, that his empire would crumble after his death. And that secret was about to explode. The Khan's favorite wife, Chabi, was dying. She was the only person who could truly calm his rages, the only one who could speak truth to his power. Her death would leave a void that no one else could fill. Polo saw the grief in the Khan's eyes, a grief that was terrifying in its intensity. He knew that a man in that state of mind could be capable of anything. A whisper in the wrong ear could be fatal. The court was already buzzing with rumors of a plot, of a Mongol general who was preparing to march on the capital. Polo had information that could save the Khan, but revealing it would also reveal his own network of spies, and his own secret motives. He had a choice to make: stay silent and watch the empire burn, or risk his own life to save the man who held the fate of the Silk Road in his hands. What would he do? The answer, hidden in a dusty memoir written decades later, would be the key to one of the greatest mysteries of the age. And it all started with a dying empress and a secret that the great Khan could not bury. Subscribe now, and hit the bell, so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. The air in Khanbaliq was thick with whispers, but Marco Polo heard a different sound beneath them all, the drumbeat of a coming storm. The great Khan's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed a grief that terrified Polo more than any army could. Chabi, the only person who could soothe the Khan's rages, was dying. And with her last breath, the empire itself seemed to be holding its own. Polo knew that the court was a powder keg. A single spark from a jealous minister or an ambitious general could ignite a civil war that would drown the Silk Road in blood. He had the information that could prevent it: names, dates, the route of the rebel army marching from the steppes. But revealing his sources meant exposing the network of spies he had so carefully built. It meant admitting that he was not just a merchant, but a political player in a game where the stakes were life and death. The dying empress's chambers were a world of hushed voices and the scent of strange incense. Polo was summoned, not as a servant, but as a confidant. Chabi, her face pale as the moon, spoke of her fears for the Khan, for the empire, and for the fate of the countless souls who traveled the Silk Road. She looked at Polo with eyes that saw through his carefully crafted persona. "You see the cracks in the foundation," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "You know what the Khan refuses to see." She spoke of a general, a man she trusted, now marching from the western provinces with a banner of rebellion. "He believes the Khan has grown soft, too trusting of foreigners like you." Her words were a knife, cutting through Polo's carefully constructed world. He wasn't just a merchant anymore, he was a symbol of everything the old guard despised. And he now held a secret that could save the empire or doom it forever. The Hanlin Academy, once a sanctuary of scholars, had become a den of spies. A sealed message from a Sogdian merchant, a man Polo had done business with for years, confirmed Chabi's worst fears. The general, a man named Nayan, had already amassed an army of 300,000. They were not just rebels, they were the standard-bearers of the old ways, who saw the Khan's tolerance of foreign religions and ideas as a betrayal of Genghis Khan's legacy. They were marching not just to dethrone Kublai, but to burn the Silk Road itself, to close the borders and return to the isolation of the steppes. Polo held the damning letter in his hand. He could take it to the Khan, expose the plot, and save the empire. But the letter also implicated a senior Chinese minister, a man who had long been Polo's enemy. If he revealed the letter, he would reveal his own intelligence network, his own spies within the court, a move that would make him more powerful but also more vulnerable than ever before. The rebellion was not just a military threat, it was a spiritual one. Qian was not just a general, he was a champion of the shamans, the ancient spirit worshippers of the steppe, who saw the Khan's deathbed conversion to Buddhism as a fatal weakness. The Mongols were divided against themselves, a house split down the middle. Polo was a Christian, a Nestorian, a man of a foreign god. In the eyes of the shamans, he was a demon to be purged. But in the eyes of the Khan, he was a valuable asset, a window into a world beyond the endless grass. Polo saw the empire for what it truly was, a fragile dream held together by the will of one man. And that man was dying of a broken heart. The Khan's grief was not just for his wife, it was for the empire he knew was crumbling around him. He had seen his own sons become weak, his generals grow jealous, his people lose their way. He was the last of the great Khans, and he knew it. In the dead of night, Polo was summoned to the Khan's private quarters. The great Khan was not on his throne, but sitting on a simple stool, staring into a brazier of coals. He looked old, broken. The death of Chabi had taken a piece of his soul, leaving a hollow shell. "You know," the Khan said, not a question. "You know about Qian." Polo's heart hammered against his ribs. This was his moment. He could lie, and hope to survive the coming storm. Or he could tell the truth, and risk everything. "Yes, my Khan," Polo said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know." The Khan nodded slowly. "My own flesh and blood. My cousin. He wants to take me back to the old ways, to the yurts and the endless sky. He thinks I have become soft. He is wrong, but that does not matter now." The Khan looked at Polo, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "You will come with me. You will see how a Khan deals with a traitor." The battle was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Qian's army, vast but undisciplined, was crushed by the Khan's loyal forces. Polo watched from a distance, a witness to history. He saw the Khan, not as a philosopher or a leader, but as a force of nature, a man who could order the deaths of hundreds of thousands without flinching. Qian was captured, wrapped in a carpet, and trampled to death by horses, a death reserved for traitors, so that their blood would not touch the ground. The rebellion was over. The Silk Road was safe. But at what cost? Polo knew that the Khan's trust was a double-edged sword. He had seen too much, knew too much. He was a living memory of the Khan's weakness, his grief, his brutal rage. He was a threat. And as he stood among the victorious warriors, amidst the stench of death and the cries of the dying, Polo realized that the greatest danger no longer came from the rebels or the shamans. The greatest danger was the man he served. The golden cage had just become a prison. The dust from Qian's cavalry had barely settled when the true weight of what Polo had witnessed crashed down on him. This was not a victory, it was a warning. The Khan had crushed his own blood to prove a point, and Polo knew that he, a foreigner, was now a living testament to that brutality. The court, once a place of vibrant diplomacy, now felt like a tomb. Every smile was a mask, every whisper a potential conspiracy. Polo saw the fear in the eyes of the other advisors, the same fear that was coiling in his own gut. He had served the Khan loyally for years, but loyalty was a currency that could be devalued in an instant. He was a ghost in the palace, a reminder of a moment of weakness, and ghosts, he knew, were easily exorcised. The golden cage was no longer just a metaphor, it was a tangible, suffocating reality. He had to find a way out, and he had to find it fast. The opportunity, when it came, was wrapped in silk and sealed with a princess's tears. The Ilkhan of Persia, Arghun, had lost his wife and requested a new bride from the family of the great Khan. The Khan, ever the pragmatist, agreed. The bride chosen was the 17-year-old Princess Kokachin, a girl of extraordinary beauty and gentle spirit. And who would be the perfect escort for this precious cargo across half the world? The man who knew the routes, the languages, the dangers. The man who had become a liability. Marco Polo saw the path to freedom in the princess's eyes. A journey by sea, around the treacherous coasts of Southeast Asia and India, would take 2 years. It was a perilous mission, but it was a mission that would take him away from the court, away from the Khan's watchful gaze, and back toward the world he had left behind. He volunteered without hesitation. The fleet that left the port of Xiongnu was a floating city, a final, magnificent display of the Khan's power. 14 massive junks, their sails like clouds, carried not just the princess and her massive dowry, but also an entire ecosystem of sailors, soldiers, merchants, and diplomats. Polo stood at the prow of the lead ship, watching the Chinese coastline shrink into the mist. He felt a strange mix of exhilaration and grief. He was leaving behind the most powerful man on earth, a man who had both elevated and imprisoned him. He was sailing towards a future that was uncertain, but it was his own. For the first time in 17 years, the world felt vast and open again. The sea was a different beast than the desert. It was a highway of storms and monsters, of unknown islands and stranger peoples. But it was also a road home, and Polo was determined to survive it. The voyage was a descent into a world of terrifying beauty. They sailed through the Strait of Malacca, where the water was so shallow you could see the seabed, and pirates lurked in the mangroves. They were battered by typhoons that turned the sky black and the sea into a raging monster. Polo saw islands where headhunters painted their faces and traded in spices that were worth more than gold. He saw the great temples of Java, and the elephants of Sumatra. Every port was a new bazaar of smells, sounds, and dangers. The princess remained below deck, protected from the worst of the storms, but Polo could feel her anxiety. He was responsible for her safety, for her honor. The fate of his own life was now intertwined with hers. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose his freedom, he would lose his head. After 2 years of hardship, they finally reached the Persian Gulf. Polo had survived the sea, but the journey was not over. He delivered Princess Kokachin to the court of the Ilkhanate, a mission accomplished. But the Polo brothers, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco, were not the same men who had left Venice decades ago. They were now wealthy beyond measure, carrying the Khan's golden pesa, a passport that granted them safe passage. Yet, they were also ghosts, men out of time. They had to make a choice. To stay in the East, rich and respected but forever strangers, or to turn west, towards home, towards a Venice that had probably forgotten them. The decision was made for them when they learned that the Ilkhan's successor had taken a liking to the Polos and was reluctant to let them go. They had to escape, again, this time from the very people they had risked their lives to serve. They slipped away in the night, leaving behind the wealth and the danger. It was a final, desperate gamble. They crossed the Black Sea, sailed past Constantinople, and finally, in the year 1295, they knocked on the door of their own house in Venice. They were unrecognizable. Dressed in rough Mongol clothes, speaking with a strange accent, they were treated as beggars. It was only when they tore open the seams of their shabby coats and a cascade of rubies, diamonds, and emeralds spilled onto the floor that their family and friends believed them. They were rich beyond imagination, but their adventures were not over. They were just beginning to be told. And as the 3 weary travelers sat by the fire, recounting their tales of Kublai Khan and the wonders of the East, a question hung in the air. The Silk Road had made them, but what was it doing to the world? The Khan's empire was fracturing, new powers were rising, and the old routes were shifting. Marco Polo's story was a testament to the road's glory, but was it also its eulogy? That was the story that the world was about to learn. They were rich beyond imagination, but their adventures were not over. They were just beginning to be told. And as the three weary travelers sat by the fire, recounting their tales of Kublai Khan and the wonders of the East, a question hung in the air. The Silk Road had made them, but what was it doing to the world? The Khan's empire was fracturing, new powers were rising, and the old routes were shifting. Marco Polo's story was a testament to the road's glory, but was it also its eulogy? That was the story that the world was about to learn. But first, Marco Polo's own story would take one final, unexpected twist. A twist that would turn him from a merchant into a legend, and a simple travelogue into the most influential book you've never read. But to understand that, you have to understand the strange and violent world he returned to, a world where Venice and Genoa were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the Mediterranean, a world on the brink of its own transformation. Venice in the 1290s was a city of masks, both literal and figurative. A city where a fortune could be made or lost on the turn of a tide, and where a man's word was only as good as his sword arm. The Polo family knocked on the door of their own home, a grand house in the San Giovanni Crisostomo district. The door was opened by a relative who didn't recognize them. They were dressed in rough Mongol clothes, speaking a strange, accented Venetian. They were treated as beggars, turned away from their own inheritance. Think about that moment. After 24 years of unimaginable hardship, of crossing deserts and seas, of serving the most powerful man on earth, they were rejected by their own family. It was only when they tore open the seams of their shabby coats and a cascade of rubies, diamonds, and emeralds spilled onto the floor, glinting in the candlelight, that the truth finally dawned. The prodigal sons had returned, not as beggars, but as the richest men in Venice. The story of their travels spread like wildfire, and it eventually reached the ears of a man who would become Marco's cellmate. In 1298, a few years after his return, Venice and its rival Genoa went to war, a brutal conflict for control of the eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Marco, a wealthy and respected citizen, was given command of a galley. He was a merchant, not a soldier, and his ship was captured during a fierce battle near the island of Curzola. He was thrown into a Genoese prison, a dark, damp cell that could have been the end of his story. But it was there, in that prison, that Marco Polo met rustic Hello de Pisa, a writer of romances and chivalric tales. Polo needed to pass the time, and rustic Hello needed a new story. And so, the world's most famous travelogue was born, not in a palace or a library, but in a prison cell, dictated from the memory of one man and written down by the hand of another. The book they created, originally called Il Million or The Million Lies in some circles, was a sensation. It was a catalogue of wonders, paper money, coal, strange animals, and cities with more people than all of Europe. It described a world where the great Khan ruled with absolute power, where the streets were paved with gold, or so it seemed, and where a man from Venice could rise to become a governor. But the book was also met with a flood of skepticism. People called Marco a liar. They said he had never been to China, that he had made it all up from the tales of other travelers. They mocked his stories of strange beasts and black stones that burned like wood, what we now know as coal. The book's very title became a joke, a byword for exaggeration. The question was no longer about the road's glory. It was about the credibility of the man who had walked it. Did Marco Polo really see what he claimed to see? Or was he the world's greatest storyteller, weaving a fantasy that would capture the imagination of Europe for centuries? But the skeptics couldn't stop the story. It spread across Europe, translated into every major language, read by kings and merchants, scholars and explorers. It didn't just tell of the past, it shaped the future. 2 centuries later, a Genoese sea captain named Christopher Columbus would read Marco's book, filled with notes in the margins, and become consumed by the dream of reaching those same lands of gold and spice. Columbus carried a copy of Il Million on his own voyage west. He didn't find the court of Kublai Khan, but he found a new world that would be forever connected to the old, a connection that was, in essence, a continuation of the Silk Road itself. The road had shifted from land to sea, from the camel caravans of the Taklamakan to the caravels of the Atlantic. Marco Polo's story was the bridge between those two worlds, the spark that turned the memory of an ancient trade route into the engine of a new age of exploration. But even as Columbus set sail, the old road was breathing its last. So, what is the final truth of the Silk Road? A network of paths that carried more than just silk, it carried ideas, religions, diseases, and the very seeds of the modern world. It made empires and destroyed them. It brought together East and West, only to tear them apart. And it gave us a story, Marco Polo's story, which may be part fact, part fantasy, but which remains more powerful than any simple truth. But as the old road faded, a new shadow was rising from its ashes. While Polo's book was inspiring sailors to look west, a new conqueror was forging an empire of blood and iron in the heart of the very lands Polo had traveled. His name was Timur, a man who would build pyramids of skulls and reunite the shattered pieces of the Mongol Empire. A man who claimed descent from Genghis Khan himself. A man who would send ambassadors to the courts of Europe and China, demanding tribute, and who would leave a trail of destruction that made the Mongol invasions look like a minor border dispute. Marco Polo opened the door to the east for Europe. But the next traveler through that door would not be a merchant with tales of wonder. He would be a messenger of terror. Polo's book was a testament to the road's glory, but was it also its eulogy? That was the story that the world was about to learn.